Okay, welcome back. I will hand it back to Mr. Tong. You were about to ask a question.
I wanted you to look at the comments made by Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister of UK at the relevant time. But subsequent to him stepping off, he made a comment which I'd like you to look at. Again, I'll put it up on the screen. So this was a publication in 2011. If you look at the second line, Freedom of Information Act has achieved greater transparency, but has hindered progress in our trusting of politicians. Let me look at some passages and ask you some questions.
Yes.
Freedom of Information Act, 3 harmless words. I look at these words as I write them, and I feel like shaking my head till it drops off. You idiot, you naive, foolish, irresponsible nincompoop. There is really no description of stupidity, no matter how vivid, that is adequate. I quake at the imbecility of it. Thus, Tony Blair records in his memoirs what he believes to have been one of his greatest mistakes while in office, introducing legislation intending to shed light on government in a manner that empowered people. It is a dangerous act, he went on, because governments need to be able to debate and decide issues in confidence. Do you place stock in that, Ms. Han?
Yes, I believe that there are scenarios in which governments can justify having confidential information. And in fact, in the UK, there is a committee, a de-notice committee, although its name might have changed now, that brings government and the media together to discuss to what instance information should be made public and reported on, and what instance it should be redacted or kept confidential.
But that's precisely the problem, right, that we have to grapple with, because the extent to which we are suggesting that, or rather you are suggesting that information be made public or at least be exchanged, would impede the way in which governments would work. Would you agree?
It doesn't impede the government's ability to keep things confidential for legitimate national security reasons. A Freedom of Information Act does not mean that every single classified top secret document automatically become public.
Yes.
And so within the UK, even with Tony Blair's Freedom of Information Act, there continues to be regular engagement and talks between government and the media about what is information that should be reported on and what should be kept confidential. In fact, for Tony Blair, what really undermines government trust is complicity in the Iraq War and the allegation that there were weapons of mass destruction. That really kills public trust. And I wouldn't say that was the Freedom of Information Act that killed public trust. I would say dropping bombs from Iraq on the basis of no real basis of weapons that aren't there kills public trust.
The exchange of information between government and media,
yes,
the way you describe, I think, regardless of whether the act exists or doesn't exist, I think should be there. That's my view, at least. But what you're suggesting goes further, and it is sometimes not easy to say what is or is not.
Yes, hence the engagement.
Hang on, let me finish. And what might or might not become matters which could be released, as opposed to matters which you know at the time you're discussing will be kept in confidence. Wouldn't you accept?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
The question is, sometimes you won't know in advance, at the time you're having a discussion or having a paper written up, as to whether something is or is not going to be released at that point in time. Would you agree? And that I think, is the nub of what Tony Blair is saying, that you can't discuss it in confidence, you don't have the confidence to go and do it, and in his words, to debate and decide issues.
So you're saying that civils... correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is you're saying that if there was a Freedom of Information Act, public servants and politicians might be concerned about what they're discussing at the time because they are worried that it will become public at a later date.
Matters that affect security, matters which affect the way in which governments do their work and decide on matters, form their decisions, would become subject to scrutiny. And that's not necessarily a good thing, is it?
I would say scrutiny is a lot of the times actually a good thing. They should be subject to scrutiny. They are elected officials. And as I already said...
No, Ms. Han,
excuse me, let me finish. As I already said, the existence of a Freedom of Information Act does not preclude things being classified and top secret. So the UK does have a Freedom of Information Act. It does also still have plenty of documents and operations and exercises that are still classified and top secret.
Well, let's look at what was said by Prince Charles, which was then released subsequently. So there's an article, May 2015, where the title is Prince Charles Criticized Iraq War, Resources in Blair Letter. Not sure if you're familiar with this event, but this article relates a story where Prince Charles wrote to Prime Minister at that time to explain that he felt that there was question of the resources not being optimal. He had questioned whether the equipment, the helicopters and other items that he had were sufficient for its purposes. And this information then became released.
Yes.
Now, do you think that's a good thing?
Yes, people should know if there are concerns that the future monarch might have political leanings, then yes, people should know that.
No, it's not about political leanings. It's about disclosing matters which affect directly the security interest.
No, but they're not saying that they've blocked the disclosure because of security interest. They've blocked the disclosure as ministers had feared publication could damage the heir to the throne. So why should we be so overly concerned about protecting the heir to the throne?
Yes, but the consequence of this production is that it would be, do you think it's in the interests of UK citizens for this to be revealed to the UK's enemies in the Middle East, for instance?
It is not clear that this was classified information because the whole article says that they kept the letter secret in case they cast doubt over the future king's political neutrality. It doesn't say that it was classified information. For all I know, because I'm just looking at one article, for all I know, there's some other news report somewhere happily reporting about the Lynx aircraft being used.
No, this Lynx aircraft is one of the items used in the conflict. And to the extent that you want to keep your private information about your own resources, about the ability of your own resources, about the weaknesses of your own resources or your own troops, don't you think that's something that is something best kept from public interest?
But again, it's not clear that this is all classified information. It could actually be already public information.
Well, if you have a Freedom of Information Act that is broad, information like this, I'm not saying only this, but like this would get out there. And do you think it's in the interest of the country for its political opponents, for its counterparties, in this case, a warring party, to be aware of this?
I really don't think you're correct. You're offering a fair example here because, again, it also says that despite the Guardian newspaper requesting access to the letters, the governments were able to block the disclosure through using the regular due process. And, if they do want to block the disclosure, it is still within due process, for example, of a Freedom of Information Act, for the government to go to court and argue for why it should not be released. It's possible. And again, like these UK examples, perhaps the Freedom of Information Act in the UK is flawed. I haven't seen the legislation, and I'm not a lawyer to make that discussion, but all that tells us is maybe the UK has a crappy Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah, but that's
are we saying that Singapore cannot possibly draft one better if we had one?
No, I think I'm not sure that's a fair statement for you to make.
I said perhaps.
Are you aware that there was a subsequent independent review of the impact of this act in the UK?
No.
I'll show it to you. It's a Frontier Economics report dated October 2006. So it's a fairly long report. I'll just show you an executive summary portion of it. So it says here, the first paragraph, each of these groups, the group surveyed, tend to contain a mixture of one-off requesters and serial requesters. So they are both. Journalists make up a significant proportion of the serial requesters, and then it sets out some of the details and what they account for.
It's disappeared off the screen.
Sorry, can you please keep it on the screen? Do we have it? Can we get it back on the screen? Yes, okay. So we're looking at the upper section. Third paragraph, journalists are also one of the most significant categories of requesters. Overall, in terms of total, across central government and the wider public sector, journalists account for at least £3.9 million, or 16% of the total cost of the FOI delivery. And then thereafter, there lists a series of requests which are not in the spirit of this Act. For example, if you just look, and this is the UK's review, request for the total amount spent on Ferrero Rocher chocolates in the UK. Request from a vintage lorry spotter to 387 local authorities for the registration numbers of all vintage lorries in their stock. A request for information on a sweater given by President George Bush by number 10, and the list goes on. So yes, they are not national security classifications, but do you not regard this as something that one has to think about, the impact it has on government resources?
Do we not value transparency over the fact that some people might ask for the total amount of money spent on Ferrero Rocher chocolates? Wouldn't the principle of transparency and open access to information, public information, be an important principle to uphold? Yes, of course, there will always be some joker who wants to know how much was spent on pineapple tarts in the ministry or how many tissue boxes were bought. But I would say that the principle of transparency and the principle that it would demonstrate the government's standing of accountability to its people outweighs the fact that some people will ask for very random things.
And the way you would contemplate this Act working is that at some stage, not immediately, but at some stage after a time lapse, information will be disclosed.
Yes, I believe that for particular I think there's two parts. So one is the freedom of information, where people can request for public information, and if it's a national security issue, the government can go and contest it. But then separate to that, I also suggested that we have some process of declassifying classified documents after a lapse of time. Yes.
So in those situations, issues of national security or otherwise,
yes, after a lapse of
disclosed.
time, when if it's considered that after this lapse of time, it's no longer a security issue, then yes, it should be declassified. If it is still considered to be a security issue, then the government, of course, should have the avenue to argue that case and to argue for it to be continued to be classified. So, for example, just now in that Prince Charles case, I note that the Guardian requested the information in 2005, but the article was only in 2015, which, after 10 years, we've moved on from the Iraq War, so I think that's also perhaps one of the reasons why it was eventually disclosed.
In neither of these cases, in the scenarios you outlined, would it be an effective countermeasure to a viral online post that is false? Would you agree?
So this is more of a holistic kind of long-term non-legal measure of addressing the issue.
Right. Well, it's legal because you're proposing new legislation.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Right.
Yes.
For once.
Yes, for transparency, of course. Not all legislation is bad, but for transparency, yes, legislation.
I thought you might say that, but
yes.
But the point is, it's ineffective to deal with the kind of problems that we've just seen, where there's an online viral post that is going viral quickly, causing incitement and potentially property harm, destruction, and also loss of lives.
It's ineffective for tackling that one specific post, but I think it does.
But that's a very important post.
But it does have also an impact on long-term holistic public trust and social cohesion that we cannot underestimate. So, for example, if we further build public trust and exchange and social cohesion, when there are future posts like this, people would be more literate, people would be more educated, people also would have more trust in each other and in the public institutions, and that actually also erodes the impact that falsehoods could have.
Well, let's look at a further study on this. This is a bit more recent.
Yes.
An article titled "Who Uses FOIA?" An analysis of 229,000 requests to 85 government agencies.
Which country?
US.
Right. The first couple of paragraphs just sets out the way it was done. I just wanted you to look at the second page. And the breakdown is who makes FOIA requests. by category of persons. And you'll see that a disproportionately large number are commercial entities. Businesses take up almost 40%, law firms 16.7%, news media 7.6%, and non-profits 7.5%. Would you regard this as an effective use of the Freedom of Information Act to deal with online falsehoods overall? Or could this be used as corporate mechanisms to find out information and to seek commercial advantages?
I don't see it as a problem if it's public information that's not deemed to be dangerous and in necessity to be classified. So the whole point of it being freedom of information and being public information is that it doesn't matter who asks for it. If it is, of course, a security issue that needs to be classified, then yes, that would be classified. But otherwise, I don't have a problem with who is asking for the information.
And irrespective of the fact that, based on this poll, the most frequent users of this, the top 10 most frequent requesters, are all commercial businesses. Makes no difference to your analysis.
I wouldn't automatically assume that just because it's mostly commercial businesses that it's not effective. I mean, businesses also engage in fact-checking and debunking because it affects their bottom line.
Look at the table below this. The top 10 users are International Business Research, and by name it tells you what they do. Disclosure Insight, Check Fund Manager, FOI Services Inc., EACM Advisors, Bioscience Advisors, Reuters, FOIA Group, Merck, and EMSI. By definition, the first two tell you what business they're engaged in.
Is it a bad thing that they have data to
No, it's
make
not.
that decision?
It's not that it's a bad thing. It's just that the use of the act that you're proposing, with its attendant consequences on national security, with its attendant consequences on deployment of resources that we looked at, one has to look at what is the countervailing upside. And the upside is largely being used by persons who have a business interest in the information as opposed to what you are suggesting.
But if there is an upside for individuals, journalists, NGOs, universities to use it, I don't begrudge the businesses the upside that they get as well.
Well, let's look at Australia then. Can you... Let me find the reference. Give me a second. Yes, can you look at what John Fraser said in an article that's entitled Australia's Top Public Servants Call for FOI Reform? Yes, Australia's most senior public servants have called for freedom of information laws to be amended to conceal sensitive advice to ministers from public scrutiny. Departments of Prime Minister and Cabinet Secretary and so on outlined their vision at an industry event, claiming it would strengthen government policy. The FOI Act does not afford sufficient protection to public servants. As leaders, we need to use exemptions appropriately, but I would suggest going further. This is not to reduce accountability, not to protect us from stuff-ups we may have made, but to enhance capacity to give true, frank, and fearless advice that good policy design needs. A view that echoes what we saw earlier from the UK. Would you agree with this?
I don't find it surprising that public servants feel like there should be more protection for public servants. No, I am not necessarily that sympathetic to it. I feel like they should be accountable. And I appreciate frank and fearless advice, but if they really have a commitment to good policy, then they should be ready to give that advice and stand by it publicly, even if it's made public.
I think what you're articulating is, I think, an aspiration and an objective that you wish to achieve. But what we are seeing is that in practice, on the ground, this is what the Act has, in practice, affected the work of public servants, civil servants, and we've seen it across the UK. I've shown you some examples, Australia as well. So in exploring your contention, I'm just trying to understand whether you have paid any regard to this, whether you've studied this and given it any heed.
I admit to not having a comprehensive study of Freedom of Information Acts, but I also do feel like these are competing views. So public servants might feel that there should be more protections. They might find Freedom of Information Act very troublesome, costly, time-consuming because they have to respond to all these requests. But then on the other side, as a citizen who wants accountability, I feel like this Freedom of Information Act is important because then it allows me access to that information and it helps me build trust in institutions. And so I think there will always be tension between where the boundaries are. And that's why, if we do have a Freedom of Information Act, then I would revert to what I keep saying about engagement, and perhaps we should have a select committee on how to do a Freedom of Information Act that would meet Singapore's needs.
I'm sure that will be considered.
I'm sorry, can I just interject at this point in time? Because I think Mr. Tong asked about how this is like in practice. I think I'll be best positioned to answer that because I have worked for the British government in Singapore in the communications portfolio, and it is not as onerous as we would like to think. And I'll just leave it that a lot of it has got to do with tying down processes. And in this sense, I think Singapore has some of these processes in place, but more can be done in order to make FOI a reality. That's what I'm saying.
I'll come back to you, Ms. Han, just to summarize your overall views, so make sure I understand it correctly. You are largely saying this, that you don't regard as appropriate a response to any online posting, false or otherwise, and regardless of the extent of damage to property or to injury to persons it may cause if it goes viral, that an appropriate remedy should be legislative and one which requires a takedown.
No, that's not true. So I'm saying that what we don't need is further legislation that polices and regulates content. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any response. In fact, what I'm saying is that we already have a lot of legislation with which we can respond.
Right. So your view that the existing legislation is sufficient is the sole basis on which you say that we don't need any more new ones.
It is a main basis that I say we don't need any new ones. And then again, I'm sorry for taking up your time repeating myself, but I'm saying that new ones might also create unintended consequences that actually undermine trust and end up being counterproductive.
And this is despite the fact, as you've seen, that there are polls which indicate that Singaporeans wish to have that legislation and wish to be protected from online falsehoods. 92%.
I question that survey because I feel like the questions are very leading and it's badly phrased.
Well, leaving that aside, I would just ask you to frame your answer on the face value of that survey. Even with that, you would stand by your views?
Yes, because it is my individual view and I stand by what I believe.
And this is despite the fact that, as I've tried to show you at the start of these proceedings, that evidence has been led, including from the law professor, that there are gaps in the legislation.
I disagree. I'm sure the law professor had his view, but I have a different view.
Right. And would you accept that your view, based on this research, would be dissonant with the majority of Singaporeans on this question?
I don't know. I haven't polled all the Singaporeans.
No, based on the research publication that I've shown you, 92%.
Again, I highly question that survey, but even if we take it at face value, and yes, perhaps I am out of step with 92% of Singaporeans, but that's okay with me. I don't feel the need to change just because the majority feels one way.
Now, as a content provider, as a writer, would you agree that one has to provide full information and verify the sources and check the facts as accurately as possible?
As much as we can. In fact, as a journalist, I find that a lot of times my attempts to provide full information is impeded by the lack of a Freedom of Information Act.
Again, I thought you might say that, but I think it doesn't stop one from checking the facts, cross-checking it,
yes,
and verifying it from third-party sources as well.
Yes, of course.
Right? So there's no lack of means available.
There is a lack of means when I call the police for comment and to confirm that someone has been arrested, and he says, I only speak to MCI accredited journalists. You might not be a real journalist. I cannot tell you where Silan Palay is, even though I've seen a video of him being arrested. And I tried to call the police to verify, and they said, I cannot talk to you because you don't have an MCI card.
Well, there must be a reason for the accreditation.
Well, perhaps, but I'm just trying to make the point that sometimes the full range of measures that I would like to access, I cannot access. It's not that I've never tried to apply for MCI card. I was told I cannot have
yes,
one.
and within what you regard as constraints, you would do what you can to make sure that the facts you put out are accurate.
Yes, I try to.
You
do
would
what I
regard it
can.
as a duty that you have,
Yes.
right? And because you are content providers, that duty is one that is to be taken very seriously.
Yes.
And if you were to issue a story or an article that is half true and half false, that would effectively be false, correct?
I think, again, if we are you talking about the Asia Times article? Because I think...
No, I'm not. I'm
established-
asking you in general terms. If you put out something which is made up of untruths, mixed up with truths, that would also lend itself to a story that's ultimately false, or a position to be taken as ultimately false.
I would not then characterize that as false in this context when we are talking about what's fake and what potentially might come under legislation. I think there are inaccurate stories, there are skewed reporting, there are just downright bad journalism. There is a whole range of stories that are problematic across a whole range of publications and journalists ourselves constantly argue and debate whether this story was written well, whether that story was written another way, who wrote what, how, constantly reading your own story, then reading a competitor's byline and comparing it, going, why didn't they write this? Why didn't they do it this way? This is constant amongst journalists that I know.
No,
but
Ms. Han.
I think I would shy away from saying just because some things might be inaccurate, some things we might feel is untrue, then it becomes a false story.
No, I think, Ms. Han, I think you know that there's a difference between what one might write artistically or journalistically, and you might form a different way on your style of writing and presentation. But that's quite different from making up a story that is made up of truths and untruths and passing it off as a story.
I mean, what do you mean when you say untruths? Like outright fabricating quotes?
That either that or statements which are reckless, no regard for the truth, not checked.
Again,
Would you
reckless and no regard for the truth could again be a matter of interpretation. So if you're talking in a scenario where, say, a journalist claimed to go to an event that they actually did not attend and made up quotes
Or a quote from someone who's a phantom?
Yes, or just flat out made up quotes, then yes, that journalist's credibility should be in the dirt. And I don't feel sorry for a journalist like that. But if it was a matter of, why didn't you include this report or that report? Why didn't you quote this in full? Why did it get truncated? Then I think that's very different from saying that someone's fabricated something.
You would also accept that it is important as a content provider to set out the facts and the basis on which you are setting out an opinion as far as possible. Would you agree?
Yes, to try to provide fact, yes.
Right. And applying that to the Human Rights Watch report, that would also apply. If you want to take a view or advocate a certain position, then as far as possible, the facts on which you formed that view should be set out fully. Would you agree?
I believe they set out their
No, but
facts.
would you agree? I mean, whether they did or did not is a matter
Yes.
of view, but would you agree that should be done?
Yes, they should set out facts and substantiate their claims.
Right. So in the context, for example, of the Alan Shadrack case, one should set out fully the facts on which the alleged scandalizing of the judiciary was done. Would you agree?
I think as the way that journalism works, that you would never fly with saying, I have to list out all the allegations, all the charges, because then your editor would just cut all that out because they said you're taking too much time.
You would need to set out, obviously you've got to determine what you can do, but you've got to set out within reasonable boundaries, facts which would not lend your story to an unreasonable conclusion, not formed because of a lack of appreciation of the underlying facts.
But you see, this here we are talking not about fabrication, but about editorial choice. And sure, we can hugely disagree over one's editorial choice of what to leave in or what to report or what not to say. But, again, that I would really shy away from calling that a false story. So, for example, during the run-up to the Administration of Justice Protection Bill, I was part of a campaign to highlight the problems of the bill, and I made a number of public statements about the bill, and there was a Straits Times story that talked about the bill and its passage, and that online there was some unhappiness, and it simply referred to me as Facebook user Kirsten Han, rather than setting out the context that I was a very active member of a campaign that criticized the bill. So should we say that that was a falsehood? I was unhappy with that characterization of suddenly going from being an active member of the campaign and therefore a stakeholder that could be quoted to becoming just a Facebook user. But I would not at all call that Straits Times story a falsehood. I would dispute that journalist's editorial choice. I believe that journalist said his reason for it was that there wasn't enough space. And I disagree with that choice, but I wouldn't say it was false.
No, that's a question of description. What I'm saying to you is if you're trying to advocate a view, then I think the facts, the complete facts which support or detract from that view ought to be set out so that your readers can judge.
But
That's
again,
that
is a matter of editorial choice, because as journalists, we cannot list every single fact that's related to the issue.
Don't repeat that, but I know. But the point is, within that context, you must also know what facts you should set out, which would lend your story or your conclusion to a credible landing, and also provide the basis for people to form a view.
I'm sorry, but it's not that I'm deliberately trying to be difficult, but I do have to repeat again that it is a matter of editorial choice, and that is the answer that I can give. I mean, I cannot change. My answer will not change.
Are you saying it's outside of your control?
No, I'm saying that it's a choice that every journalist and editor makes in the creation of a story.
And that choice...
And it can be disputed, and it can be criticized, but I would really be very cautious of then saying, oh, this is false or this is fake news.
But that choice must be driven by trying to set out as full as possible an objective or fair basis on which the conclusion of the article of the story is based.
Well, so that's a question of intent then, in which each journalist have to speak for himself or herself. But
For yourself?
For myself, I try as much as I can, but I make editorial choices as well, and that's an issue between me and my editor when the story gets worked on. And of course, I've seen many people who disagree with my editorial choices, and they should be free to hold that view.
Okay, Mr. Lee, I'm going to ask you some questions on your report.
Yeah.
Can you look at what you say about the Michigan State Union publication? A state university.
Yes.
You have it, paragraph 12. Now, were you aware that this study was commissioned by Google?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
And that it was also funded by Google?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Right. And you're also aware that this study was focused not so much on online falsehoods, but focused on the behavioral patterns and the algorithms created by search functions on Google.
I believe it is responding to how online users use online resources.
For search, right?
As a means of finding information. Yes, search.
In the search engines, right?
Yes, that's right.
Right. Now, you also talked about election advertising in your report. Do you recall that?
Election advertising in my... I'm sorry, would you be able to
Yes,
pin it
can
down
you go and look at paragraph 9?
Paragraph 9. Yes.
Right, you make the point that, well, we don't have to be worried because we have strict rules on election advertising, and this concerns the question of foreign intervention.
Yes.
Now, I just want to show you the cascade effect, the diagram that we've seen before. So can I just put it up there? And I think you can see it on your side, Mr. Lee. Have you seen this before?
Sorry, just give me a second.
This diagram essentially talks about how from one Twitter account with some followers, where there are then quotes by various media outlets, and how that cascades into different platforms. And the point from this really is that those platforms transcend geographical or legal jurisdictions.
I might have seen something like that, probably not this exact one, but yeah, the concept is not unfamiliar to me, yes.
Right. There is a similar one I can show you just 2 pages down from this. This was cited by Ben Nemo, one of our representatives. And you can see that
right.
the point here is the moment you put out something, it's carried and transcends geographical boundaries. And so the extent to which one can, in your case, use the election advertising rules as a bar to foreign presence or foreign intervention would be limited. Would you agree?
Excuse me, I believe these 2 diagrams that you show me refer to the spread of information, or are they related to the spread of funds?
No, they relate to the spread of information, but the interference can be from a completely different originating source. Doesn't have to be in Singapore, for instance, but yet can affect the proliferation of information. Would you agree?
I don't see how that is possible, because all media outlets in Singapore are required to declare their advertising sources, especially foreign sources, to IMDA.
You look at the spread in this way. It can be online, it can be mainstream, it can be hard copy, it can be soft copy.
Sure.
So do you agree? You don't?
Sorry, again, what are you asking me to agree on?
I'm asking you to...
Whether does this system bypass our election advertising laws? Is that what you're trying to say?
What I'm trying to ask you to consider is whether you have thought about this point when you made your comment that the election advertising provisions would be sufficient to curtail the foreign funding and foreign intervention in the spread of information online.
Oh, insofar as it's coming into Singapore, yes. The spread of information, no, of course not, because we can only police what's happening within our boundaries. But I'm sure we're talking about Singapore here, yes?
Can I show you the testimony of Colin Stretch, who is the General Counsel of Facebook, when he was asked this question, and see if you agree? I'll again put it up on the screen. So this was Colin Stretch giving testimony in October 2017 to the US Senate Committee. And I'll just show you some paragraphs on it. 3 paragraphs on the bottom. When it comes to the 2016 election, I want to be clear. The foreign interference we saw is reprehensible and outrageous and open a new battleground for our company, our industry, and our society. That foreign actors hiding behind fake accounts abuse our platform and other internet services to try and sow division and discord and to try to undermine our election process is an assault on democracy. It violates all of our values. Over the page, where he specifically addressed investigating the role of ads and foreign interference, he said, we learned from press accounts and so on that Russian actors might have tried to interfere. This is not something we had seen before. We found that fake accounts associated with IRA spent approximately 100,000 on more than 3,000 Facebook and Instagram ads between June 2015 and August 2017. Our analysis showed that the accounts used these ads to promote roughly 120 Facebook pages that he had set up. In turn, posted more than 80,000 pieces of content between January 15 and August 2017. Advertising by accounts associated with the IRA, and below is an overview of all of this. And if you look at the advertising by accounts associated with the IRA, you'll see that the amounts are spent are set out there. And right at the bottom, the contents of the ads, most of them appear to focus on divisive social and political messages across the ideological spectrum, touching on topics from LGBT matters to race issues to immigration to gun rights. A number of the ads encourage people to follow pages on these issues, which in turn produce posts on similarly charged subjects. And over the page at B, the content posted by pages associated with IRA estimate that roughly 29 million people were served content in their news feeds directly from IRA's 80,000 posts over the 2 years. If you go further down, the best estimate is approximately 126 million people may have been served content from a page associated with IRA at some point during that same 2-year period. would you say that this shows that there's a high degree of likelihood or probability that a foreign actor can set up these accounts, fund it, and yet have the information proliferate and affect lots of people within your geographical domain?
If they're able to, I would agree that they're able to set up these accounts and allow it to proliferate across geographical boundaries. Whether it has an effect on the recipients of these messages, I'm not too sure about that.
Well, when it is,
I haven't read anything that confirms that, which was also one of the points that I raised in the green
at the
paper.
start, yeah, because you said that you're not familiar with matters of how this online falsehoods affect national security.
No, how they affect the users who actually receive such information.
Yes, this example shows how, in Facebook's case, as this example shows, the use of these accounts by IRA has proliferated socially divisive messages. In this case, all I'm saying to you is that it is capable of being done. Would you agree?
It's capable of spreading these messages, yes.
And the Election Advertising Act that you refer to would not stop this. Would you agree?
It would not stop people from receiving such information if they are of that particular inclination, as in based on their profile on social media. No,
Right.
They would be able to receive, such posts in that sense if their profile aligns with those.
They would be able to, correct?
Technically speaking, technically they will be able to. Yes.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lee. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Mr. Singh, I believe you have some questions.
I just have one question, Chairman. And this question is directed. Firstly, before I pose my question, thank you so much for sitting through quite a few hours of testimony. My question is specific to Ms. Han, and you spoke earlier about freedom of expression and how in a case of incitement, and I believe it was a situation of, it is a very clear hate message which has a potential to an incitement to violence. I believe that was the statement. Now, in that sort of context, and would you countenance, let's say, take down mechanism, a power that a government, an elected government can have? It doesn't mean that because it has that power, it will exercise that power, because each situation is different. You have to consider the Streisand effect, and so forth, backfire, and it does not mean that if you have those powers, you will compel a tech company to take down content at every occasion, because every situation is different.
Yes.
Now, if that was the contours of potential, well, it's the bad word for you, legislation, would that be something that could be considered and would be realistic, particularly since we would agree that in view of the international definition of or the boundaries surrounding freedom of expression, incitement to violence is a red line, and if that red line is crossed, do you think that there is actually some scope to consider in specific instances, not as a broad sweeping power to be activated all the time, for government to actually compel content, a site which hosts content like Facebook, to take down the particular site, to take down a particular post very quickly?
I believe that we already have laws that could compel this sort of takedown of content, whether it's the IMDA regulations, the Broadcasting Act. If it's a falsehood, the Telecommunications Act. If not, we have, the Penal Code, the Sedition Act, the Maintenance of Religious Harmony laws. If it's worried about undue influence of elections, we have legislation related to undue influence of elections as well. We have a lot of laws that, even if they are not specifically about targeting falsehoods, can actually be used in the instances of the harms that we think will be triggered by these falsehoods. So that my position would be that even if we say that there should be takedown, we already have laws that allow that.
Okay, so conceptually, it is not haram to not to have a policy where you actually have to take down something.
Yeah,
since we already have those powers.
I would
your
urge
view.
that to be like the very last resort, but if we already have those powers, then I'm saying we don't need more, or we don't need to double up or overlap legislation.
I understand.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, Ms. Han, if it is clear that there are gaps, because your assumption is that the laws are there, are sufficient, but if it is conclusive that the existing legislations, all the different acts, is incomplete, is unable to address what you just mentioned, would your view change?
I would have to actually see that first.
I understand. We had the benefit of hearing of not just one professor, but a few professors who affirm those findings. But it's fair that if you've not seen it, it'll be good for you to review what they presented to us.
Thank you.